If you would, please turn in your Bibles to Revelation chapter 18. Revelation chapter 18. Last Wednesday evening, we talked about the first 5 verses of Revelation chapter 18. And this goes along with chapter 17, denoting that God is going to deal with those who have been persecuting the 7 churches of Asia. And that's what Revelation brings to light, is that God is going to deal with that problem. And the people, of course, are crying out, well, when? Well, it's going to be in God's time, as we have noticed this. In verse 1, it says, "After these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his glory." So here we find a messenger coming from God. It's going to deal with all the situations that are plaguing the church here in the first century. Now, when we come down to verse 4, it says, "I heard another voice from heaven saying, 'Come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive her plagues.'" In essence, don't be involved with the stuff that you see around you in the world, but live a righteous life. Continue to have that sign of righteousness. In verse 5, this is very important as we move into verse 6. It says, "For her sins," talking about Rome, "have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities." So as we go into verse 6, it brings to light that this payback is going to be difficult for Rome. What's going to happen and what they're going to deal with is going to be very difficult. It's going to be horrendous. In verse 6, it says, "Pay her back, even as she has paid, and give back to her double according to her deeds, in the cup which she has mixed, and mixed twice as much for her. To the degree that she glorified herself and lived sensuously, to the same degree give her torment and mourning. For she says in her heart, 'I sat as a queen, and I am not a widow, and I will never see mourning.' For this reason, one day her plagues will come, pestilence and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire, for the Lord God who judges her is strong." When we look at this, we note that Rome is about to learn a lesson of sowing and reaping. They've sown the wind, and now they're going to reap the whirlwind. God commanded that Rome be punished and that vengeance would be extracted. In essence, as we look at this, the double punishment in verse 6 is going to require that double repayment. And that was something that was extracted under the law, the old law, as we note in Exodus chapter 22. It notes here a more likely explanation is that it refers simply to a balance of scales, not in the sense that the scales become even, but rather in the sense that Rome would be placed on those scales in the same position that Rome placed the church. In other words, they were persecuting the church, and they were going to get a double whammy out of this, what they had been doing, and the lifestyle and everything that was going on in Rome. It notes here in verses 6 through 8, teaches us 2 lessons about this judgment. Number 1, the first lesson is that that a man sows what he reaps. And we see that same thing noted in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7, where it says, "Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sowed, this he will also reap." You know, whenever we get on down there to Let's see about verse, let me look here. Verse 2, I believe. Well, let me get it on down there where I need to be. Verse 7, where it talks about, I sat as a queen, and I am not a widow, and I will never see mourning. That reaps back into this situation. In essence, Rome didn't think that anything could come against them, that they were able to just do whatever they pleased and there would be no recompense. We live in a world today who stands opposite of the truth found here in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7, as well as in the Old Testament, that whatever we sow, so shall we reap. In our world today, it is noted as whatever I sow, I'm not going to have any circumstance for that. And that is a very widespread ideology that is in our society today. Rome had that same ideology. Well, nothing's going to deal with us. We're not going to have any consequences for what we are doing to the church, much less saw everything else that was going on there in Rome. The second important lesson that we learn from Rome's fall is that all human pride will one day be humiliated. And we think about the passage over in Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 18, where it says, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. If you look back in history, Rome didn't think they could be beat in a battle. They didn't think that their incursion in another land or in another nation, that those people could push them back. They didn't believe that. They believed that they were the Almighty, they were the greatest, there was nothing greater, nothing could ever be greater. And we see that in individuals today who do things in our world that denotes the idea that there's no recompense, there's no situation that I will have to deal with. Even if I do this, I'll get off with it, if you will. And I'm sure that many of you that have worked with prisoners know that none of those guys are guilty. And they should never have been thrown into prison. That was just too much. That's the way society, even here in Rome and today, thinks about those things. In verse 7, Rome boasts that she will never see the very thing that God said that she would see. And it notes again the passage that I just read a part of a moment ago. I said as a queen, I am not a widow, and I will never see mourning. So we have an elite position noted here, an elite position. And we think about the widows of the day. As long as there were those that were supporting the widow, she was A-okay. There was no problems. And that was what families did. If there was a widow that had children, those children took care of the widow. When we think about Rome, Rome had her children, which would have been all the outlying countries that they had overtaken. It would have been the populace there, that they was going to be okay. And then they note this very last part, will never see mourning. I will never see the recompense for my actions. Well, they were prideful in that. They let that be known, as people today are prideful about the realities that whatever I've done in the past, I'm not going to suffer any consequences. And people are taught that, and people believe that. Well, pride falls into that same thing. You see very public people today who have this ideology that it doesn't matter what I've done, that there's no consequences for me. And they're very prideful in that idea. Well, pride is one of the 7 things that God hates in Proverbs chapter 6, starting there in about verse 16 and going down to verse 19. And the pride that God hates is the arrogance of those who feel they have no need for God, or that they will never see consequences for the things that they've done in this world. Because Rome fell. That was a consequence. When we think about individuals, they either reap the consequence of their actions in this world, but especially after they make the transition into the next. When they find themselves standing before God guilty of the things that they've done in this world and hear those terrible words, "Depart from me, I never knew you." Now that's a sad reality, but that brings to light what we're seeing here in Revelation. There are consequences for one's actions. Well, God's punishment for pride in the Old Testament was to inflict extreme humility or humiliation, and that is what God promised Rome. They would be humbled, and they were. In Proverbs 11:2, it says, when pride comes, then becomes dishonor. And prideful situations are dishonorable. Rome would plummet from her glory to her destruction quickly, and her destruction would be total and complete. And it was. When Rome fell, it fell hard. Rome's affluence, pride, gaiety would be replaced by death, mourning, and famine. When the empire fell, it was gone. It was a terrible thing. Both Babylon and Rome were filled with pride, and both later had to eat their boastful words. They reaped what they had sown, in essence. Now, as we move into verse 9, this brings to light that Rome's fall was going to be that which had consequences outside of just the city of Rome, and into the Roman Empire. In verse 9, it says, and the kings of the earth who committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her will weep and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance because of the fear of her torment, saying, woe, woe, the great city Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And again, the quick fall of Rome. It didn't last very long. It was there, and then they turned around and it was gone. Well, think about all of these outlying nations that had committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her. When they seen Rome fall, guess what happened to them? They too fell. Because they were so connected with Rome, even though they may not have liked being connected to Rome, they fell. And we'll see here in just a bit in the next verses that a lot of that was a financial situation that they fell into. But when they saw her burning, they were concerned. They didn't know what was going to happen next. Let's just put it this way. Well, it notes here that her arrogance is the same as the great empire, a sense of invulnerability, overwhelmed, and she boasts even against God. And surely the Roman Empire boasted against God. They didn't think that they were vulnerable anywhere, that they could win anything. I encourage you, if you're a historian like I am, go over and read some history about when Rome made it to the Rhine River. You know, they never took possession of anything north of the Rhine. Up there in the Black Forest, the people up there, the Germanic people, they stopped them right there. And think about Hadrian's Wall. Whenever they run into the Scots, they stopped them right there in Britain. So they thought they could just go in and take all these places over, but toward the end of the Roman Empire, it became very evident that there was other peoples in the world that could stand opposed to them. And they reaped the whirlwind in both of those places. The demise of the harlot will come suddenly because it is God who judges her. Now, this judgment is not a judgment of the Germanic people or the Scots, but it is a judgment of God. And it was going to happen. It was going to come together, and it was an encouragement for the 7 churches of Asia. Now, in verses 9 through 19, it contains 3 dirges of Rome. And now, a dirge denotes the idea of a funeral song. Rome's going to die. It's a funeral song. The first, in verses 9 through 10, is a dirge sung by kings. The second, in verses 11 through 16, is a dirge sung by merchants. And the third, in verses 17 through 19, is a dirge sung by shipmasters and sailors. Each of these dirges speak of the greatness, the wealth, and the luxuries of Rome and the outcome of what happened. These are descriptions of Rome is historically accurate. The Talmud says that of the 10 measures of wealth that came down into the world, Rome received 9, and all the rest of the world only 1. Rome was powerful. Rome was wealthy. I mean, they were the preeminent. And again, we take it from a nation to individuals in our world throughout the centuries. Well, even those that received the 9 measures of wealth, still they would fall. I mean, they would fall one way or another. Going back to this context, Rome's wealth was concentrated in and controlled by the emperors. Suetonius described Nero this way. Nero, as I've noted to you guys a few times, and you go back and study about old Nero, he was nuts. Man was insane. He really was. He was insane. But this is what he wrote, and I quote, "He never wore the same garment twice. He fished with a golden net drawn by cords woven of purple and scarlet threads. It is said he never made a journey with less than 1,000 carriages, with his mules shod with silver." I mean, whenever he went out and about, he wanted everybody to know it. He didn't wear the same garment twice. You know, he's not like us. We have to wear the same one for years and years and years. You know, and then we patch it and wear it some more. No, he didn't do that because he had everything. And this is talking about Nero. Some of the things that old Nero did, like burn half of Rome so he could build on to the palace and then blame the Christians for it. Now, that's another story in and of itself, as we've talked about. The kings in these verses placed great faith in their military might and the power of Rome. How could they possibly lose while relying on Rome? And what they did not know until it was too late was that Rome is fallen. And again, 2 instances in history was when they come up and faced the Germanic people above the Rhine, and also the Scots in northern Britain. The Romans could not conquer them. They dealt with the Romans harshly, especially if you look over at what went on in the Black Forest and the Germanic people of that time. So we go into verse 11, and it notes, "And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn over her, because no one buys their cargo anymore." Think Rome's going to fall. Rome's going to fall. Where are they going to sell their goods? Verse 12, "Cargoes of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls and fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet and every kind of citron wood and every article of ivory and every article made from the very costly wood and bronze and iron and marble and cinnamon and spice and incense and perfume and frankincense and wine and olive oil and fine flour and wheat and cattle and sheep and cargoes of horses and chariots and slaves and human lives. The fruit you long for has gone from you, and all things that were luxurious and splendid have passed away from you, and men will no longer find them. In verse 15, it continues. The merchants of these things who became rich from her will stand at a distance because of the fear of her torment, weeping and mourning, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, she who has clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour such great wealth has been laid waste, and every shipmaster and every passenger and sailor and as many as might make their living by the sea stood at a distance. It was a devastating thing when Rome fell, because all of the area there in the Mediterranean, all of that, even to Britain and to India and all of those kind of places where the Roman Empire was set, all their merchandise, all their imports and exports and all of those things, it was over, and there wasn't any money. They hit bottom. They had a depression. Let's put it that way. We would understand that. The kings of the earth who had hated Rome's extortion, they didn't like that Rome was there, but it benefited them, so they accepted it. The safety, the luxury, they fell for it, and they suffered for it. This lament by the merchants is very similar to that likely modeled after the lament over the city of Tyre that we find over in Ezekiel 26 and 28. These verses describe the great commercial success of Rome. In verses 12 through 14 in particular describes the vast extent of Rome's trade. And they were trading, like I said, all the way from India, China, all the way to Britain. You know, in Britain, they were getting tin to make brass. The North Africa, all of that whole area, that was their trading area. And there was all kinds of spices that we just read about a moment ago. All these things, the gold, the silver, everything coming in. Astridius left us the following descriptions of Rome's vast trade, and I quote, merchandise is brought from every land and sea, everything that every season begets, and every country produces. The products of rivers and lakes, the arts of the Greeks and the barbarians, so that if anyone were to wish to see all these things, he would either have to visit the whole inhabited world to see them or to visit Rome. So many great ships arrive from all over the world at every hour, at every season, that Rome is like some common factory of the world. For you may see such great cargoes from the Indies, or if I wish, from the blessed Arabs, that you might well conjecture that the trees that had been stripped naked, clothed with Babylon, ornaments from the barbarian lands, everything flows to Rome, merchandise, cargoes, and produce of the land, the emptying of the mines, the produce of every art that is and has been, everything that is begotten and everything that grows. If there is anything you cannot see at Rome, then it is a thing which does not exist and which never existed. They had a big deal going on there. All this imports and everything else was all coming to Rome because that's where the finances were. That's where all these things were. And, you know, if you get in somebody's pocket, I always said if finances start dwindling, what happens? People squeal. You got my money. How am I going to get more money? Whether it's justified or unjustified, legal or illegal. Well, here was one of the things that was very prevalent and still prevalent in that area, especially in parts of that area, maybe I would say. And that is when we talk about the idea of slaves, that is human souls in verse 13. Now they had all the spices, the perfumes, all the oils, the wine, the cattle, the sheep, and the cargoes, but also slaves in human lives. Dear friends, slavery is not anything that's new in our world. It has been that which was established from the beginning, and it's sad, but it is true. And the Middle East is a place, in North Africa is a place where it has been preeminent for centuries, for ages, and in some places still prevalent in those places. So the selling of humans, slaves, souls, and the human lives brings back the idea of souls, because everyone has a soul. But they profited greatly over this. One of the things that you will learn if you study history, back in the 1800s, there in the Mediterranean area, there were the barbarians. No, that's not what they called them. Not barbarians. I'll think of it here in just a minute. Anyway, there was individuals there that was so ingrained in the slave trade, they would go to Britain and they would go up the coast of Europe and capture people to bring them back to the Mediterranean for slaves. It was a big deal. And the Barbary is the Barbary Coast situation is what you'll have to look up. But that was in the 1800s, where they were going out and taking people and enslaving them. And that does not even include all of those from Africa that was enslaved through that time period by these individuals. Continuing in our overhead here, it says a better translation might be slaves, even the lives of men. And they were taking people's lives into slavery, is what it's talking about here. There were some 60 million slaves in the Roman Empire. There was more slaves than there were free men in the Roman Empire. It was not unusual for a man to own 400 slaves, and those slaves were used for many different purposes. Some masters had slaves walk in front of them so they could return the greeting of friends when the master was so tired or disdained to do so. Another had an educated slave stand behind him at a distance to supply him with witty quotations. Others used slaves to remind them when to eat and when to sleep. And, we've all heard of a multiplicity of things about the slaves. They were taken to the Colosseum, and these were fighting slaves. It'd be kind of like if you had a race car. They'd bring them up there and they'd buy the best guy over here, this slave, and he'd go in there and fight to the death for you because he was a slave. And slavery, again, as I have noted, is not dead in our world today. And it is very evident all over our world, especially involving some individual ideologies of our world. Slavery is absolutely okay with them. And they still do it. We don't. I don't. Christians don't. But they do. Let's put it that way. This society was built on luxury and wantonness and pride and callousness to human life. And personality is necessarily doomed. They didn't care anything about human life. And look at our own world. It's not a big deal to take a human life that's in the womb. No big deal. Just do it. It's just blob. Don't worry about it. Well, because of the loss of all this merchandising, all this import-export deal, the merchants were weeping. There was no business. They were in a depression. Their lament is not for Rome, but it's for them. It's kind of like whenever people are defrauding something and that fraud is shut down and they're out there crying in the streets. My goodness, where am I going to get my money? Where am I going to get? Yeah, I'm a fraud. I've been cheating people. But if you make me quit doing that, what am I going to do? Am I going to have to get a job? And, I got a deal today on my phone that said that I had won what was it? $1,018 cell phone. Yep, I did. And it was an iPhone 17, I think is what it said. And I only know that because I read it quick enough to push that button over there. It said scam. Delete it, and it was gone. People doing it today. Well, here's these people lost their business. It got in their pocket. Now they're squealing like a pig under a fence. They weren't worried much about Rome. They were worried about them. They had merchandise to sell. They couldn't sell it. Nobody to buy it. No money. The merchants, like the kings, stand far off and watch the destruction. They don't attempt to help the city. They don't attempt to help Rome because Rome was a stronghold destined to endure forever, but it didn't. The merchants believed that Rome was a market destined to endure forever, but it didn't. It didn't last. It didn't work. There's one message in Revelation is that there is but one eternal kingdom, and that's the Lord's church. And that eternal kingdom is not derived by man, but it was bought and paid for by our Lord on the cross. So let's stop there tonight at verse 16, 17. And we'll take up there next time we meet. And think about the situation with Rome and compare it to our world today. It's not any different. People are squealing and squalling because their illegal activities have cut off their money. Rome, punishment is from God. It's a lot worse than the punishment that man could place upon man. And think about how many people don't believe in consequences. It is a sad reality that people falter away and don't believe there's consequences for their actions. But whether it's in this world or in the next, there will be consequences, one way or another.